In the second season of Jobless Reincarnation, it could be submitted that the action gets dialed down a bit, but what's replacing that is diving deeper into Rudy's efforts to not repeat the mistakes of his past life, and also to explore all the things that he avoided in his first life. But to summarize the season, from episodes 1, well actually episode 0 to I believe 24, Season 2 really focuses on trying to work through a lot of his personal issues, from Eris abandoning him, developing erectile dysfunction, and his issues with Paul, to dating. Rudy finds himself coerced to face his problems head on as he lacks the privilege to hide and sulk as he did in his past life. This leads to new adventures that take him from different cities and ultimately land at Renault University, in which he begins an adventure within himself. So, get into the review section. Even though it's very weird to highlight this, but as we said throughout the episodic recaps and reviews, Rudy's growth, especially the whole erectile dysfunction arc, was something that was surprisingly well executed. And I mean, in many ways, you can see this as one of your usual coming-of-age stories, but usually when it comes to coming-of-age stories, especially when it comes to boys, everything just leads to having sex and that solves the issue, or finding a girl and that solves everything. But I would submit that that wasn't necessarily the case when it came to Jobless Reincarnation. Rudy had multiple opportunities to have sex with people, including a guy named Soul setting him up to possibly have sex with a sex worker. But that didn't cure his problem, which was erectile dysfunction, and it wasn't because, anxiety or anything like that, but he had emotional damage after Eris slept with him and then abandoned him, which kind of sent him down a whirlpool. And watching him trying to deal with that issue while he meets other girls, some who actually wants to be romantic with him, but he can't perform, it's one of those storylines that you don't expect to see in a TV series, never mind an anime. Never mind an anime that is so diverse, multifaceted, whichever way you want to put it, as Jobless Reincarnation is. It seems like the type of thing you would find a show that's just focused on that one thing, which has a bunch of jokes and ways of lining things up, but instead it really pushes Rudy to explore what it means to find friendship, to have intimacy with somebody, even when you're not in the pursuit of having sex with them. And even outside the ED thing, because I feel like we've been focusing too much on that, there's also Rudy trying to bond with Paul, him finding this parental figure in Soul and kind of making him like a paternal replacement when Paul's not accessible, and add in when his little sister Norn has issues and he's thinking about his own relationship with his brother and how his brother tried to a certain degree, but he kept pushing him off. There's so much that goes into emotional development when it comes to Rudy this season that is, even with season 1 setting the precedent, it still feels kind of surprising because you don't consistently see a whole person kind of evolve rather than just one part of them, which usually is either them getting stronger for a fight or them building up to having a happy ending with somebody that they like. Which leads to the next highlight, which is just how the show juggles so many characters. And I'm talking, whether you're talking about the early parts of the season where Rudy's part of Counter Arrow, his wife at Renault University, or even when the show doesn't focus on Rudy and instead is focusing on Sylphie's time amongst the nobility and the Sora, there's dozens upon dozens of characters introduced. And note, a lot of the ones from the first or the first half of the season don't necessarily show up in the second half, like the aforementioned Soul, but some from season 1, like Rudy, show up. Eris makes a sort of appearance toward the end of the second season, and what all this does is kind of like Game of Thrones in a way where it pushes the idea that everything doesn't revolve around a character that you happen to be focusing on. Everybody has different stuff going on, and yes, when it comes to some characters, it may seem like their life is on pause, but for other characters, they don't appear because there's so much going on that they have no reason to cross paths with Rudy. Like, Ghislaine does not show up in this season at all, and Kashirika, who is Bodyguard, who appears in this season, his wife, even though he mentions that they're together, he never brings her to Renault University to kind of not reconcile, but to reunite or meet Rudy, even when Rudy gets engaged, when Rudy gets married, or upon Rudy having his first kid. So, a lot goes on, as we just kind of spoiled, but more than likely you've seen everything by the time you listen to this. So, point of the matter is, there's a huge amount of characters, and thankfully, Jobless Reincarnation isn't the type that tries to pack everybody into every single episode, but instead, it spaces them out so that when they do appear, either they have something to contribute to Rudy's story, or they're moving their own story along, rather than just showing up for the sake of the fans getting to see their favorite character again and again. So the next highlight is that when it comes to Jobless Reincarnation, as just noted, Rudy goes on a massive journey, one that is especially emotional. There's a lot of characters involved, and when it comes to some characters, they're on their own emotional journey that sometimes is related to Rudy's, sometimes it's not. For example, Nanahashi, she's on this journey of trying to get back home because she's from Japan, and like Rudy, she was transported, but she wasn't reborn. So she's still in her same body from before and is trying to figure out through circles and other type of magic how to get back, and it's even pushed that she's the one who caused a transportation event. So with that in mind, her doing all this work, even having Rudy get involved to try to help her, and her failing, you see this sends her into a dark place. And when it comes to Rudy, he's dealing with multiple characters throughout the season, at least two, who kind of get put into this place, and he takes it upon himself to try to do something for them. But Nanahashi, he brings her home and doesn't necessarily nurse her back to health, but shows her the kind of support and initiative that Rudy might have got from his brother at one time, but he didn't really get from anybody else because they pretty much gave up on him when he was becoming too inconvenient. And then when it comes to his siblings, as shown throughout this season, I think part of the end of last season, nope, just this season, Norn, who is, I think, the middle child, if not, was Aisha the middle child? Either way, Norn, who is Rudy's little sister, she hates Rudy's guts. But unfortunately, while Paul is trying to rescue Zenith, we see Norn and Aisha has to come to Rudy's home, which is this big mansion he gets with Sophie. She cannot stand the fact that the Rudy she knows and the one everybody is treating like this big deal character, they can't reconcile in her head, and this sends her down a bit of a hole. And again, Rudy is pushed to be, in this situation, a bigger person and try to do better and do more than perhaps what others would do for him at one time. And granted, one of the things we love about this emotional journey for Norn is that it's not perfect. Toward the end of the season, when Rudy does get to rescue Zenith but loses Paul in the way of doing so, you can see Norn is torn between her brother just lost an arm to rescue their mother, but at the same time, in the effort of rescuing their mother, they lost Paul. And, because Norn is trying to, again, reconcile who everybody says Rudy is to compared to who she knows him as, she was thinking that everybody would be rescued, wouldn't be no issues, yet here we are. And then on top of that, he's talking about marrying Sophie after they had sex and cheated on Sophie. No, he wanted to marry Roxy. Too many names. Also, it's hot as hell and the air conditioner's off. But anyway, he wanted to marry Roxy. He cheated on her, he cheated on Sophie. And she goes through it as she usually does, to the point where she sends you back and forth between hating her guts, just loving to hate her, to kind of feeling something for her, which for a character who's not necessarily a large part of the story, I feel is very notable. And then when it comes to Aisha, it gets even more complicated because Aisha is the daughter of a concubine, and as we saw through her mother Lilia, she was possibly born out of Paul cheating, which of course she probably knows by now because the way Norn's mouth is, she probably said something. Never mind, I think Norn's grandparents might have said something to her. I remember somebody said something that kind of messed with her head. And getting to the point, Aisha very much seemingly wants to step into her mother's footsteps, and I don't think it's because she wants to honor her mother and she really values what her mother does, but I think that's how she feels like she can compensate for what problems her birth caused. And one of the two major moments she has is, the first one is when Rudy's trying to work with Norm because he can tell she hates his guts, and because he's working so much with her but is being very stunned with Aisha, she feels like she's not getting the same kind of attention, the same kind of leniency and all that, just because they don't share a mother and father together, which was a very emotional moment. And then the second time is when Aisha gets reunited with her mother, and she almost asks for permission to like embrace and like have this moment with her mother, considering Norn and also Rudy are mourning their father, and Zenith at this point is basically a vegetable. And just seeing her have to ask for permission, like she can't be happy unless her older siblings are happy, or her siblings in general are happy, it really shows the effect that the life that she's had on her thus far has been on this little person. And again, it's the kind of stuff you don't really expect from a show like this, especially as we're going to a little bit later. This show still maintains a lot of the stuff that gives you pause. Getting to some of the final highlights, even though season 2 is not like season 1 where there's a lot of action scenes, there's still, especially toward the end of the second curve, a bit of battle scenes that show you how powerful Rudy is that I appreciated. And again, you're not inundated with it, but because they're so spread out and not that often, they don't lose their luster, and it's just enough to remind you that Rudy is far more powerful than he was in season 1. Maybe at times not the best person to go out into combat, because even with that magical eye that he was given, he still makes mistakes that didn't necessarily have to happen. But he's still, I think he's only like 17 by the end of the season, so he's still got a long way to go before he can be considered a master of any of the arts that he does. Which leads us to the last two, and one is just how we're so glad that when it comes to this season, most of the main storylines wrap up to the point where there's no real cliffhanger. I mean, technically, with us seeing Eris in like one of the final scenes, there's kind of a cliffhanger about what's happening with her. We're going to get her over so that we can kind of get an update. And then, of course, there's the whole Ariel situation in terms of, so with Sophie having this kid, is she still going to eventually, with Rudy, help Ariel take back Azura? Never mind what happened to Ariel and Eris's grandfather, but again, depending how this show works, you could say that the first season was just to establish everything, the second season was to really develop emotionally who Rudy is, and the first season could delve into a lot of the politics that were established, especially in the first part of the first curve this season, but then kind of dropped off as things started to really go on with Rudy. And just to finish this off, in terms of what's going on with Rudy and what we see with other characters, this isn't just stuff we just find yourself saying, oh, that's so sad or that's so sweet. You will find yourself crying while watching this show. When people die, when people go into dark depressions, it's not just something that happens on screen. It could potentially personally affect you, especially if in some way you relate to it. For when it comes to Jobless Reincarnation, it's not one of those shows where the character's down, they make some fun little animation about them, and then there's some comic relief that's thrown into it. It's not that kind of show. If something bad happens, they're not going to deal with it forever in a day, but it's going to be something that weighs on the character, and even in lighter moments, there might be a moment where they look to the side and kind of miss somebody, or else they'll just outright say how they missed that somebody didn't get to see this part of their life. So that's what kind of show this is. It will hit you where it hurts to the point where you will be in tears. Now, I'm not going to say it's going to be so bad where you're going to be questioning why don't you drink more water, but it is going to be something where you're going to get one of them Denzel and Glory tears coming down your cheek. which leads to the final two topics, and that's the on the fence topics. And the first one is the aforementioned whole Ariel situation, because it's kind of weird how, for most characters, yes, Nanahashi doesn't get back home by the end of the season. And in terms of, I don't think anybody else really has a storyline besides Nanahashi and Ariel outside of stuff that happens with Rudy. But point of the matter is, even though the show does juggle multiple characters well, and those who don't show up, they at least notice, or you know that somebody's thinking about them besides Rudy. Unfortunately, when it comes to what's happening in Asura, when it comes to the whole political aspect, everything is established in the first part, whatever, of the season, and then most of that kind of dies down, is not really touched upon in the second half. Again, you don't know what happened to Lord Soros Boreas Greyrat. He got beheaded in the last season, never followed on, even though we're in Asura at the beginning of this season. When it comes to Ariel being in exile, it seems like her brother was trying to kill her. I would think that one way or another, somebody would have discovered that she's in Renault University all this time, but apparently not. And all we can assume, or even hope in some ways, is that when it comes to season 3, they'll dive deeper into this so that we can kind of get a resolution to all this. And that's on top of finding out what's happening to Eris all this time, Nanahashi possibly getting home, though who knows how many seasons they want to spread this show out for. Which leads to the last on the fence topic, and that's kind of the stuff we have to address, and that's just that Jobless Reincarnation is far from this perfect, emotionally developed, sprinkling some action, yada yada type of show where you just say positive things. No, this is still very much a show that has ecchi, controversial moments, and yeah, I mean, and not only that, mostly, if not all of it, comes from Rudy. Rudy's the one that buys a child slave. Rudy's a person who's somewhere beyond his 40s, who has interest in teens and girls who may be in their early 20s at best. Rudy's the one who decides to torture 2 beast girls to the point where they call him master after he does his torturing. And on top of that torture, is still him having Roxy's panties in an altar, and it's a lot of stuff that makes it so when you talk about this show and say all the good things about it, it feels almost like an obligation to also mention that, hey, before this sounds like an outright recommendation, I need to tell you there's a certain few things that you need to be aware of that may make you think twice about continuing this show. And granted, all the controversy is huge sometimes. When it comes to Roxy taking advantage of Rudy when he was depressed about his father, it's inappropriate, but not the worst thing. When it comes to Rudy buying Juliet, I think she's not an elf. She's some type of magical creature, but him buying a slave, yes, it's uncomfortable, but at the same time, Rudy's in a fantasy world where he's seen over his lifetime, especially when he was in the demon world amongst other places, a lot of people be slaves, so it's nothing new to him. Granted, him being so nonchalant about buying the kid that's a slave does seem a bit off, but you know, the more bigger issues comes from him groping the 2 beast girls while he's trying to torture them. And of course, him being somebody who's 40, 50 plus years old, if you combine his past life and his current life, and him pretty much exclusively focusing on girls who are at least half his age, if not in a range where they would definitely be considered underage and he's this creepy old man. But with all that said, overall, Jobless Reincarnation remains one of our top animes that we've watched, possibly ever, and it continues to be one of our favorite shows, animated or otherwise.